Welcome to ABA Inside Track, the podcast that's like reading in your car, but safer. I'm your host, Robert Perry Cruz, and with me, as always, is my fabulous co-host. Sorry about the verb tense agreement issue there. Who do we got? Sorry.
Hey, Rob. Or Diana.
Hello, Rob. It's Jackie.
I'm sorry. I'm usually very good with grammar. It's usually something I take pride in. I one time had to do a whole training on grammar. I didn't have to. I chose to. But, that's enough about grammar, because that's not what we're talking about tonight. We are a podcast about behavior analysis and behavior analytic research. Every week, we pick a topic in the field, and we share some great research. Some weeks, we're even fortunate enough to have a special guest, and tonight is one of those nights. We had the chance to sit down and talk with Dr. Jim Carr. Jim Carr, who you might know from, the BACB or like a bazillion research articles. And I think one of the things that is interesting when we have guests on or when we're talking to individuals about their research is sometimes we start talking about a topic that we had never even imagined was going to be something that we would cover on this show when we first started recording. And I think tonight is definitely an example of that, because we're going to be talking all about child welfare and parent training related to improving the reunification outcomes for families who are at risk for, potentially losing custody of their children. And this, again, was not something that at the time, I think we were aware was a field that behavior analysis had a lot of great, really hardworking folks looking into and doing research and doing work and systems support for in a number of states in America. And in talking to Dr. Carr, we learned all of that very awesome and exciting information. So why don't we tell you what articles that we'll be mostly reviewing today, as well as a couple of other resources that Dr. Carr shared with us. So the main article that we'll be talking about is the effects of behavioral parent training on placement outcomes of biological families in a state child welfare system. And that's by Franks, Mata, Wofford, Briggs, LeBlanc, Carr, and Lazarte. And that was published in Research on Social Work Practice in 2013. So that's the major article we'll be talking about. But we also will be sort of, tangentially referring to another article on a similar topic, Behavior Analysis in Child Welfare, Competency Training Caseworkers to Manage Visits Between Parents and Their Children in Foster Care by Kessler and Greene from Research on Social Work Practice 1999, as well as we got a chance to talk about some other resources that we wanted to share both here and then we'll share at the end of the show. And one of the major ones that Dr. Carr shared was the Safe Care program, which you can just kind of Google and find online. That's a lot of work by Dr. John Lutzker. And you can find a lot of great resources on that. And also the BACB website about behavior analysis section has a whole area, kind of an info page on child welfare and behavior analytic work in the child welfare system. So those are some articles, those are some resources. And without further ado, let's go to our interview with Dr. Jim Carr. Jim, how are you doing?
Good. Thanks for having me.
Well, it was so great to finally get the person who re-recorded our intro and outro song on the show. We were really excited to have that. I heard recently, though, you dabble in behavior analysis a little bit as well, is what I've heard. That's the rumor.
That's my day job.
That's your day job?
Yes.
Wow, okay. A kid, of course, Jim. You are someone that I think everyone listening knows the name of very, very well from your research, from your work at the BACB. But before we kind of get into tonight's topic, why don't you give our listeners, in case they somehow have been living under a rock and they don't know who you are, a little bit about your background.
Yeah, sure. So I got my PhD from Florida State with John Daly back in '96. The goal for my career was to be a professor forever, and I taught at the University of Nevada, Reno, and Western Michigan University, and then Auburn University. And while I was at Auburn, I was elected to the board of directors of the BACB. And while on the board, our founding CEO, Dr. Jerry Shook, he became terminally ill, and our executive committee asked if I would consider replacing him as CEO. And after pretty extensive deliberation, it just felt like, duty calls. This is something I can't say no to. And so I've been at the BACB for almost 9 years now, and not exactly the plan that I had laid out, but it's been very stimulating to be there, and it's been a real honor to serve the profession.
Mm-hmm. Now, was that like, I know for us, we got into the field to mostly work with children with autism. And then, Jackie and Diana are now teaching most of the time, though they do also consult and work at their center attached to their school. I do some of that, but now also then had to learn how to do like this podcast stuff. I mean, did you find there was kind of that process of you expected to do one thing and now you've got to learn a whole new set of tools to be the CEO, of a group?
Yeah, no, it was definitely a big change, and I had a number of pretty important repertoires to learn. I was just lucky because the presidents of our board of directors over the last number of years, starting with Dr. Judy Favell, she was my onboarder essentially, and she was magnificent. And then our chief legal counsel, Misty Bloom, she was there as well, and so I had a very patient board of directors who gave me time to pick up these new skills, and I had really great kind of mentors and advisors on staff and on the board, and eventually, kind of got where, I needed to be. But it wasn't quick. It certainly took some time.
I think that's always nice to hear, as someone that it seems to take a long time to do new things. So thank you for bringing that up. I'm also really fascinated about diversification of your research lines. So usually, when I see CVs, there's like clumps of research that people have done, but you have really expanded into many, many areas. Can you explain that and like how that came about?
I mean, I can weave a story together to explain it. I don't know if that's the answer, but, probably a lot of it comes from working with Dr. John Bailey at Florida State. John had a very interesting research lab where he was the only behavior analyst in the psych department at the university. And so he built an enormous lab of doc students to be his community. So he used a junior colleague model, and about half of us worked in more kind of clinical and disability areas, and the other half of us worked in OBM. So the whole time in lab, we kind of worked with each other and learned about different projects in different areas, and really kind of cross-trained. And John, he was a behavior analyst first, and so he would do research on anything. I mean, if you came to him and said, "Hey, I have an idea about doing a study in this area," he would learn what he needed to do to support you so that the study would be successful. And when I was working with him, I did some research on Tourette syndrome, and he had never done any of that work, but he was very gracious in supporting my interest. My primary interest early on was in developmental disabilities and autism. That was always kind of the core thread throughout my years in the academy. But there were always interesting things that came along, opportunities for collaboration. Students would have ideas, and when those showed up, my guess is I probably felt the same way John did. If you're passionate about this and I can learn enough to support you in the area, and sometimes that means bringing on a colleague from maybe another area in behavior analysis or from outside behavior analysis altogether. And so, so kind of looking back, I see the diversity, but as it was happening, it didn't feel like that. So I think the study we're going to talk about tonight is kind of one of those examples where it just sort of happened, under unique circumstances, and it seemed the right thing to do, but certainly wasn't part of my research plan.
Mm-hmm. Well, it seems like a good segue into tonight's topic, talking about child welfare, parent training, the foster care system, which, again, reading your article felt very much in line with, I think, a lot of, some of the research we've seen on behavioral skills training, kind of even on, basic parent training for children with developmental disabilities. But at first glance, the idea of BCBAs or behavior analysis in the child welfare system feels very much like a disconnect. Like, well, that seems like a social work thing. I know we're a social work field as well, but I mean, how did we make inroads here? How did this come about? So would you mind just kind of sharing the genesis of this research and that work?
Yeah, certainly. You hear a lot these days, since most of us in behavior analysis, or at least in applied behavior analysis right now, we work in the area of autism spectrum disorder, one way or the other. I think, probably around 90% of practitioners work in that area. And sometimes you hear complaints and criticisms along the lines of, we've got to go beyond autism. That notion always really bugged me, because we have been beyond autism for decades in many different areas. It's just that what happened in autism, where we had advocates worked with us and basically created funding streams for services, which, created lots of new jobs and employment opportunities. That story just wasn't replicated in the other areas like behavioral gerontology or like the work in child welfare systems. And so I think this is one area where we've been doing very helpful work in since 1982. And so be happy to talk about the area, but I also think that, I think when folks have an instinct to sort of complain or lament about all the work in autism and that we got to go in other areas, I think it's really important to not talk about it that way, because I think it's disrespectful to the people who are already in those areas. And some people have been working in these areas for decades, and they just haven't had powerful advocacy groups show up and create funding and jobs for them. And some of them have been toiling away in the few dozens for decades, but doing really important work. And one of those areas is child welfare. And so, in the U.S., for example, most states have a state department that is responsible for child protective services, the foster care system, biological families whose children are at risk for abuse or neglect, and so they're now interacting with the state and kind of working on a plan to try to keep the family intact over time. The states all have different names for what this department is, but with respect to foster care, we have about almost 500,000 children in foster care in the United States. And there are also about 500,000 children at risk of abuse and neglect in the United States. And so these state departments, they have a really important and difficult job. They have lots of families who need a lot of support. And in behavior analysis, our work in this area started in 1979. There's a behavior analyst named John Lutzker. He was a professor at Southern Illinois University. And in 79, he created a project called Project 12 Ways, where basically he got money from the state of Illinois, and he would train his graduate students at SIU, and they would go out and they would actually work with, I think foster families, but definitely biological parents who's sometimes maybe had already had a child removed from the home, or there was a risk for removal. And he kind of viewed the whole thing as a skill deficit, that, parenting is hard enough under optimal circumstances.
Sure thing.
When you throw in, low education, poverty, chaotic environments, it's really difficult. And so he was able to show, I think they published their first article on this 3 years later in 82, that by teaching families pretty ordinary skills using very ordinary, ABA procedures, that they would end up with much better outcomes for their children. And then over the years, there's been more research coming out in this area. So the circumstances that led to the particular study that we'll talk about tonight were I was recruited to become the new program director at Auburn University, and Jim Johnson had founded that program. And, Jim's a giant in behavior analysis, and he developed a very kind of unique practicum system for our graduate students, where they had to do 4 6-month rotations in very different service programs. So they had more kind of diversity of training.
I love that.
And yeah, you don't see that a lot. And I think one of the reasons is it's really hard to set up and maintain.
Yes.
Yeah.
The logistics alone, not easy.
Yeah, that which is effortful is infrequent.
It's so true. So you had grad students, and they were doing all these projects?
Yeah, and one of the practicum sites, so he saw in Florida that Terry Rogers and Mike Stoudemore, they were behavior analysts working for the state of Florida. They had developed this curriculum, Tools for Positive Behavior Change, and it was basically a curriculum guide to teaching parents in the child welfare system the parenting skills, positive skills from a behavioral perspective. And so Jim got arranged for a contract between the two states. They took that curriculum, they kind of revised it a bit. It was called Tools of Choice in Alabama. And he arranged for the State Department of Human Services to actually set up a project where they would teach biological families whose children had either been removed from the home, or they were at risk of removal, approval. And he set it up where his graduate students would teach these parents using the tools of choice curriculum.
Mm-hmm.
And it was really helpful to the students because they learned parent training, they got good at behavioral skills training, they got experience in parents. It was outside of disabilities. And then when I came to Auburn and right after I did, my wife, Linda LeBlanc, she joined me and we co-directed the program. And we had students going through this, and we always just really loved this practicum and the idea of teaching parents in need positive parenting skills from a behavioral perspective. And so what we realized was that over the years, under Jim Johnson's leadership of the program and under ours, lots and lots of families had gone through this training. So we had the idea, because we were worried a little bit about sustainability.
Yeah.
Right.
There are lots of examples in history of really innovative programs. And this wasn't innovative that, obviously they were doing this kind of work in Illinois and Florida and Texas and other states, but it was an important program in Alabama. And we were really worried that at some point, there'd be an administration shift and then this program is gone.
Right.
And so we thought, we've got such a large N of families who've gone through this. What if we could figure out a way to do an empirical article showing the effects at a large N? Mm-hmm. And then that might help the state maintain the program and maybe even grow it over time. So it wasn't part of my research line or Linda's research line at all. It was just, we really liked this program and thought, having a study behind it and having a study that included members of the State Department as authors might be a good way to kind of demonstrate this effect and maybe get a little bit more buy-in for the state moving forward. And I don't know if it had that effect directly, but the program is still there and the article's been cited a good bit and seems to show the outcomes well.
And Project 12 Ways is still in existence too in SIU. I know that.
It is.
Yeah.
Yes. 41 years now, I think.
Wow.
That's a lot of years for a program. That's great, though. So when I read this article, I just find it fascinating. Like, how does one get in touch with, like, a department, like a governmental department to like pitch these ideas? Or
I would imagine you make a lot of phone calls and leave a lot of messages, and I don't know. That's what I would think with the government. I just always assume it's a lot of phone calls.
Well, I think that typically is the case for a new project, but because this had already been running under the auspices of that Department of Human Resources, one of the things that this practicum produced was students who got really excited about this work. And so after they graduated, they went and worked for the State Department doing this work in other counties. So by the time we were there in Auburn, there were 4 counties in Alabama that had this kind of parent training program in place. And that's when we realized there was an opportunity here to kind of quantify this large number of cases and figure out some way to compare it to people who didn't get the treatment. So it actually wasn't too difficult for us. The more challenging thing was writing up the data and, getting approvals and all of that. But the work itself, there was a lot of enthusiasm for it. It did take some time, but we were already working with the state doing this work. And so we already had those contacts. But someone starting from scratch, that's going to be a longer road. And maybe later I'll give some ideas on maybe how to get something like that started.
Yeah.
Yes.
And so I think one thing I loved about this article as well is that, it's a little bit different. The experimental design is different than we typically see in behavioral analytic research, and how you use the archival analysis was a little bit different, right? So those are things that I like to point out so that, if people are trying to venture past a small N, looking for good examples of how you do bigger N research, this might be one way that you can do it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Well, I was just going to follow up and talk a little bit about the design and kind of what we did. So basically the idea was, so the program itself was based on this tools of choice curriculum. It was 5 3-hour classes and then an in-home visit where, as the opportunities arose, the parents would be asked to actually practice the skills learned in class with their children at home. And there was a mastery criterion of 100% of the skills in that environment. And so, 5 3-hour classes that were taught using behavioral skills training. So, there were like brief lectures and modeling and lots of role playing and rehearsal and feedback opportunities. And at the end of that, you got the home visits. And then at that point, the program was done. Now, obviously, there could be ways to improve it with, longer follow-up and that sort of thing. But that was the essential program. And kind of skills that were taught were, things like, don't respond to sort of like junky and emotional behavior, keeping your calm, keeping your cool, differential reinforcement. I mean, look at the list in the article of the skills. Like, nothing there is unusual. This is pretty mundane stuff for behavior analysts, and the primary delivery was BST. And so what we realized is that, well over 100 families had completed this program. And because I was the person who taught research methods at Auburn and at Western Michigan University, and I always had a unit on non-behavioral research methods, or maybe larger N designs. I made a couple of observations, and so this could be what's called a quasi-experimental group design, where what makes it quasi-experimental is the groups already exist. Yeah. You're not collecting people and assigning them to different groups. And so we asked, some of our contacts at the state, are there data on other families from these same counties that opted not to do this program? And if so, what kind of data might be available? And then we realized that the state had a pretty robust database. And so what we were able to do was we located 171 families who had completed the experimental condition, or, the ABA training classes. And then we found 171 other families that we matched to.
That's awesome, right?
Yeah. I mean, I fully expected when we had a meeting with the state to learn about this database that it just wasn't going to be useful. We weren't going to be able to properly match up families, but we actually were, and we matched them on a county. Actually, was one of the main variables, because a lot of times if CPS gets involved with a family, that family may have to go to family court, and so if you have judges that are very different in their approaches to family distress in different counties, then that would be a confound. We wouldn't want hard judges in one condition and lenient judges in the other, as an example.
Good point.
And so, you have to think through those things.
Because when I read that, I was thinking about like the resources that were available in each county, and what made sense you'd want to match for those, but definitely didn't think about the judicial system. So. Yeah.
Well, yeah, I mean, that's the name of the game with biological families and the child welfare system. The state is involved at this point. And when you have a quasi-experimental design and you're studying existing groups, it's important to do a really thorough and rigorous accounting of all the possible existing variables that might constitute internal validity threats and kind of get in the way of you showing an effect. And so, we pulled them from the same counties, from the same period of time. So the same judicial policies would be in effect. And then what we did is we looked at our families 6 months after they left the program. And then we were very simply looking at what the status was with their child. And then we picked matched families and at a specific point in time after intake and looked 6 months later. And then what we were looking for were if a child had already been removed from the home, were they now reunified? Because that's the ultimate goal of most child welfare systems, is to keep the family back together. Something else you want to look at is you might have a child that's at risk for being removed from the home, but they're still at home. So you want to find out, have they remained at home? Then you want to look at, is the child not at home? Is the child with the state? Is the child living with a relative? And how many children had been removed from the home in that 6 month period? And what we found were big and statistically significant impacts on all of these variables. So if you were in the ABA parent training group, you were much more likely to be reunified with your child. You're more likely to have a kid still at home. You are 50% less likely to have a child not at home, and much less likely to have had a child removed from home. And so these were not variables that we focused on in our training because, whether a family is intact or not is more of a long-term concept, right?
Yeah.
And the goal of our program was to really teach the skills with the idea that they could contribute towards family reunification down the road. Mm-hmm. But we were able, through this, kind of large in quasi-experimental design with a patched up control group and no pretest, like a really kind of a funky but technically proper design, we were able to show really big differences between the families. And so that was information the state was interested in. And, I think one of the things that really helped our advocacy efforts in the autism area is, the LOVOS study. Mm-hmm. Now, the thing about the LOVOS study was it by itself did not do the job.
Right.
It took Catherine Maurice's Let Me Hear Your Voice and then Autism Speaks to get us to where we are today. But one of the nice things about the LOVOS study was that it had a dependent variable that people care about.
Right.
Yeah.
Which is not to diminish, percentage of intervals and rate and that sort of thing. I mean, those are incredibly valid measures for our research. But if you're looking to do research that, stakeholders and policy folks are going to value and recognize, dependent variable has to be one that is meaningful, And so I think, in the example of the LOVOS 87 study, he's looking at normal intellectual functioning at the end of long-term comprehensive treatment. And in our study, we kind of approach it the same way. Like, if you do at the county level, good quality ABA, positive parent training with biological families who have now intersected the state's child welfare system, can you get a bigger, meaningful impact down the road? And we were able to show that we were. So I think if there's anyone out there who's involved or thinking about doing some research where they kind of want to move the needle on some recognition, I would think about like a bigger, longer term dependent variable.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And so one thing that I was really excited about, which I didn't have time to look for, so I'm hoping you have the answer. So the Tools for Positive Behavior Change program, so that was based off of the Power of Positive Parenting book that we've all read. We did it for a book club, I think, over the summer, and we love it. Mm-hmm. But so did this curriculum that they use come with a manual? So did it come with like pre-designed PowerPoints, like specific role plays that you needed to do, like data sheets? Like, I'm just wondering how in depth the curriculum was, and then did you have to like supplement that when you were doing it?
So I wasn't at Auburn when they got the curriculum from Florida, but based on my understanding, it was a bit of a guide, not only what to teach, but how to teach it. But that since the curriculum was revised for Alabama, the graduate students at Auburn basically redesigned all the PowerPoints, all the agendas for, training meeting structures and that sort of thing to really kind of customize it for the kinds of parents they were seeing.
That makes sense.
Because I think that's another good point, and that is, if you're in Boston and you have families in this kind of program, they're going to be very different families than a rural southern state.
Right.
And so some customization, would appear to be in order.
Yeah, and another thing I really love about this curriculum too is those in-home visits. I think that's like critical. Mm-hmm. And when I read this, I wrote love, 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 and I like bolded it and put like so many underlines under it.
She changed all the dots on the I's to hearts.
Yeah. But that seems super time intensive. Like, I think that it's valid, but how, like if you think about the cost of the program and the home visits, and especially the home visits because you have to get 100% mastery, after the training. It's a high level of mastery. It's the highest you can get. It's a ceiling effect. Can you speak to, was there any hurdles like getting that home visit in? And I mean, has there been times where, families haven't met that criteria? Like, I know that it was like 83%, or like 70% of the parents, but like, what does that look like if they don't?
Well, then there's another visit scheduled.
Okay.
And so it was just, I think the default program included the 5 3-hour training courses and a home visit, and then when possible, additional visits were scheduled. And, and it clearly very important to have at least one observation session in the home to see what it's like there and to give feedback, in situ feedback in that environment.
Right.
But a lot of these environments are incredibly chaotic.
Yeah.
And they're not really amenable for a whole lot of, lengthy sessions and feedback and that sort of thing. And so one of the things that I did like about the program is that it got the families out of that environment for the training, right. And then the training was BST based, so they were practicing skills, but then there was the one home piece. And my guess is this model was probably borrowed from the state of Florida in some manner back in the day, and I can see this structure being set up very deliberately. You mentioned the expense. Yeah, clearly the home visits are going to be more expensive than having a 3-hour training session where 20, family members show up for training. Right. But given the outcomes, these are this is a very costly state function. Mm-hmm. And so having some way to not only, keep families together when possible, but then also save taxpayer dollars, clearly pretty valued by certain stakeholders.
Yeah, that would make a lot of sense. And then during those home visits, I have so many questions. I'm so sorry. But I guess that's my job. During these home visits, were they the graduate students that went to the home visits? And how did they prepare those graduate students to go into those chaotic environments, right? Without, engaging in some emotional responding or condition suppression, right? Like there could be a whole bunch of things that could happen.
For sure, yeah. So, in the other counties, there were actually behavior analysts who were certified at that point doing the training. But in Lee County, where Auburn was, it was the graduate students, and they did the training in class and they did the home visits. And another unique factor about the Auburn program that Jim Johnson set up was Auburn had 2 full-time BCBA supervisors on staff. Wow. To manage the curriculum and provide the supervision. And each year we only had 12 students in the program, and they were supported by 2 full-time academic faculty members and 2 full-time master's level BCBAs who were graduates of the program.
Oh my gosh.
Wow. So they knew how to do this. And so there was a lot of support there. Now, I will say that, I think this was kind of a daunting practicum for some of the graduate students. Yes. Because you're meeting with families that may be very different from, who you've experienced in your life, depending on what your family was like and, where you're from. So it was nice to have that, someone who had already been through it and gotten their degree and gotten certified and become a good supervisor, kind of shadow them and kind of walk them through that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I love that. And I think even now, if you think about how the trend in behavior analysis is looking toward making sure that all of our treatments are, culturally responsive, I think this Tools for Change probably had a lot of that in there, right?
Oh, absolutely. And, in the Auburn program, the majority of our students were from Alabama, not all of them, but that's just typically what you find in a master's program. And so I think there were already some cultural similarities, but, you're also dealing with just a huge variety of families and struggles that they have, from substance abuse to abject poverty to mental health problems, in the families. And I think that's a whole new area. And so you definitely want someone to shepherd and kind of mentor either a graduate student or a new professional in that realm. It's and parent training is interesting anyway, because when you're young, the first thing you get asked is, "Oh, do you have kids?"
Yes.
Yeah.
And then if you say no, then that can be used to sort of impeach your credibility. But if you're doing this kind of work with families that really have a lot of needs, it's important that you have support, again, to make sure that you're not only effective, but you're culturally sensitive and you're sympathetic to probably some very different circumstances than you encountered personally.
Yeah.
Right.
Jim, you mentioned some of the other barriers to children being able to stay with their biological families. So certainly drug use, mental health issues. Was that at all reflected in any of the information that was gathered as part of the study in terms of what percentage of families had originally, been, quote unquote, in trouble with the law due to history of drug use or due to mental illness? Was that just sort of not?
No, that's a good question. Yeah, that would have been ideal. But no, the system that we had access to didn't have that level of information, or if it did, it wasn't available to state parties. I do want to recognize it. So, I was the sixth author on this paper. It was my idea, and I kind of helped coach it along. But the lead author was a woman named Sabrina Franks, and she was an Auburn grad who actually was employed by DHS. And so she was kind of like their main BCBA, and I believe she was in charge of the other 4 counties, like the similar activities that were happening there. And so there was some information that we were able to get because we had DHS staff on the personnel list for the project. But yeah, we didn't have that level, and that would have been nice. You can also think, income level of the family, and the initial reason, number of other kids in the home, that sort of thing. And we just didn't have access to that kind of granular information. On the other hand, it might be good that we didn't, because then if that there is a possibility that you can kind of over detail yourself out of a control group.
Right.
That's
so
true.
true.
Because we're looking, this one family had these 8 characteristics. Now let's find another family with those 8 characteristics from that same 2.5-year period from that same county. That gets a little difficult in a kind of a low population state.
Yeah, that's very true. And so I love that in the study you point out that you specifically role played 5 of the skills, but they didn't role play 2 of the skills, but those 2 skills seem really important.
That also hard to role play.
But hard to role play, right?
Yeah.
So the 2 skills that they did not role play were avoiding coercion and using a contract, which seems, I think those are so important, but it would be so incredibly difficult to role play those situations.
Especially I think when you start talking about care for older students. I know, for younger students, you might not need necessarily a contract so much as just setting out the rules.
You're not going to have one.
Yeah.
But it's certainly for families with teenage students, I would imagine the contract would be kind of the go-to strategy to use, because just sort of like first this, then that, you're going to get the roll eyes and, I hate you, mom and dad kind of response if you're not careful.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that's exactly when those contracts would be used with older children. But, with every, kind of comprehensive curriculum that you're rolling out where you're teaching a bunch of different skills, it's not uncommon to have some segments of the curriculum that are not as amenable to evaluation than others.
Right.
And these were just the 2 of the 7 there.
But it would make sense, though, because common in parenting practices, if you haven't read The Power of Pausing Parenting, do rely on coercion. So I think it might have been very eye-opening for parents to be part of that practice, to focus more on the positive than on the negative.
I think if they're doing the first 5, then they shouldn't.
Yeah.
By default.
I read it as sort of
That's
an
right.
indirect measure of,
Yeah.
I mean, if it didn't have to come up because of if you're not necessarily doing all of the positive parenting and also using a lot of coercion,
Right.
it's going to be it's going to be difficult.
There's only so much time in the day.
You can always parent so much,
But the skills that they did role play were stay close, cool, reinforcement, pivot, stay close, hot, redirect, redirect use and use reinforcement when you redirect. So those are the skills that they.
Yeah, and these already, and this was lingo from the Florida curriculum that was brought over, because again, everything was written in non-behavioral language to teach to the families, and so like stay close, cool, that is when things are not heated or escalated. Here's your kind of normal behavior you should be engaging in with your children. And then stay close, hot, clearly when things have already gotten heated and escalated, and so things are a little bit different. But the core of all of this is attending to your child, praising and reinforcing appropriate behavior, not attending to all that junk that all kids engage in at some level. And, what's interesting is, so this is, we started the discussion by talking about Project 12 Ways at Southern Illinois University, and they include all of this, but they also include a couple of other repertoires, because Project 12 Ways, I think it's almost exclusively done in the homes. Mm-hmm. Right. So it's a very different kind of model. And one of the things they do there is that they're actually also looking at the physical environment. So they are like teaching families how to cook and prepare nutritious meals, developing structure around their day, mm-hmm. making sure that hazards have been removed from the home. And so what we did was just sort of one aspect of this approach to supporting families and the child welfare system, but there are other models. There are, all home-based models, which clearly are going to be more expensive than 12 Ways was funded by the state of Illinois. And you might be able to add on other target behavior areas because you're in the home. And obviously making sure that kids have healthy nutrition is critically important, and having clean and safe homes is important. And with a kind of a heavily home-based model, those are appropriate targets. Right. Whereas, we had information on that presented, but it just wasn't as big a focus. And also, these families were already in the child welfare system, so they already had a caseworker, and they were already getting visits and other kinds of training in the homes from the state.
All right, I hate to pause this amazing story about research, but I have to, because I want to make sure that all of you listeners get that secret code word. Yes, why a secret code word? Well, ABA Inside Track is ACE approved. By listening to this episode, you are able to earn a learning credit, 1 learning credit. All you need to do is listen to the full episode and then go to the website, abainsidetrack.com/getCEUs. Get-CEUs, I should say. And some of the information you're going to need to put in will be secret code words. We have 2 of them hidden in the episode. I'm going to give you the first one now, and it's automobile. 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 It's the fancy way to talk about the thing that you drive. You could say car, but don't say that, because that's not the code word. It's automobile.
My first car was named Otto.
Oh, excellent. But that's not the code word either, Diana. It's automobile.
Got it.
Okay, good. And before we get back to the interview, why don't we take a quick break? We will be right back with more with Dr. Jim Carr.
Do you want to be a BCBA?
Sure, we all do.
Now you can come to Regis College in Weston, Mass. to get your graduate degree.
Choose from any one of these courses.
Masters of Science in Applied Behavior Analysis.
Masters of Science in Special Education.
Dual degree in Special Ed and ABA.
Or be eligible for your postmaster's certificate.
You can complete your degree and be ready to sit for the exam in 2 years. And our 2017 grads had a 100% pass rate on the BACB exam.
Come enjoy practicum placement support, ethics mini handbooks, PhD-level professors, small class sizes, and a service trip to Iceland.
If interested, don't delay. Supplies are limited. Learn more at regiscollege.edu.
Again, that's www.regiscollege.edu, regiscollege.edu. One more time, www.regiscollege.edu. See you there!
And we are back talking all about child welfare and behavior analytic work in the field of child welfare with special guest, Dr. Jim Carr. Let's go back to the interview. Jim, I don't like to talk about family well-being in terms of money because it feels very gross. However, I understand, just like I think we all understand, that it has to be a part of a lot of discussion of services like this. Mm-hmm. Was there any sort of follow-up or look at sort of, I guess, return on investment sort of practices regarding this program, or has there been that you know of in the past years? The outcomes speak for themselves, but I know some governmental agencies would say, well, we got to look at how much it costs and how much we can budget for these programs.
Yeah, and I think if we had stayed at Auburn, because we got very invested in this program and in the study that resulted from it, I think we'd had conversations about possibly looking at that to see, like, okay, you've got this many more children remaining at home and this many more families reunified. What are the dollars associated with that? Mm-hmm. But kind of a similar curricular program was adopted by the state of Oklahoma, mm-hmm. and they've implemented it statewide, and they published an article. I don't remember the specific figures, but they did a fiscal analysis and showed that it saved the state considerable money, mm-hmm. which is important in every state, but especially poorer states, mm-hmm. where having money available for social services is, pretty remarkable thing to begin with.
Yeah. I just think about describing this, and you describe the results and you describe the overall procedure. And I don't know very many folks who would sort of turn their nose up at this idea. But then when you're talking about, and we had this many hours and they went into the home this many times and your parents had to reach mm-hmm. mastery, I could see a lot of like, whoa. That sounds like it costs so much. There's no way we're never going to be able to replicate that. I'm glad it worked. In Alabama, I'm glad it's working in Oklahoma, sure. but it's not going to work here in X state or, for whatever reason. So that is good that's out there. Because I know some folks, that seems to be the money talks is kind of the result that you need to throw out there.
Oh, absolutely. And you guys all live in Massachusetts, right?
Yes.
Yep.
Yeah. Really?
Yes. You guys are
town.
Sorry. So you guys are like, you live in a state that is the leader for social service spending in the U.S., and Alabama was probably state 48, 49, or 50.
Yeah.
Whereas, I know that in certain, like in New Jersey and in Massachusetts, some children with autism and severe needs, there might be, well over $100,000 a year available for that student's education at, maybe a special school or an ABA program. And when we were in Alabama, it was $7,000 per year for special ed with, pretty intensive needs, just to kind of give you an idea.
Yeah.
So
I used to
again, the savings are important.
But you only have so much budget from the state, and it has to be spread across many different areas of need. So I lived in Alabama, South Carolina, and Arkansas at varying points in my life. So I think I understand.
That's quite a journey.
Yes, it has been.
Yes. I'm from Louisiana originally, and Louisiana often ties for or wrestles with Alabama, Mississippi, and Arkansas for like the bottom spots on a number of measures, but particularly around spending in education and social services.
That is correct. Mm-hmm. My parents live in Louisiana now, so.
So I know we touched briefly on the results, how you saw like a lot of positive outcomes following the experimental groups and less outcomes with the control group. Do you have any information on what skills were not performed to criteria? So like 80% of the parents did well, and they scored higher than 80%, but was there skills that seemed to be more challenging than other skills?
I don't have that information. We didn't collect it for the study, but I think the curriculum was so well designed that, and again, you've got basically a 3-hour class for just one piece of the curriculum. The whole thing is done with BST. So I think that everything was set up for success. And I do recall our graduate students, doing these home visits, kind of reporting back in their supervision meetings about various difficulties. But it would just be conjecture for me to say, these were the ones that they really struggled with. Yeah, that's the real experts, the students who did the training. They're the ones that would have that information.
Right. And then I guess my final question before I move into our dissemination station section is, was any sort of social validity assessment completed for parents either now that the program's been running for a while, like how parents felt about the program, or did they not really, because they had to do this program? Was that not something that was included?
Well, actually, they didn't have to do this. So this was not court mandated. So this was a service recommended by the state, sometimes probably encouraged, but it wasn't necessary. But we did have evaluations that were not conducted as part of this research study since it had a different goal. But so the parents did complete evaluations that could be construed as treatment acceptability during the ongoing training program. And And clearly those data were responded to. But again, I think Alabama was really fortunate because a lot of the heavy lifting on this had already been done in Florida, a much richer state. And then Alabama took it and modified it and showed that it was able to work, both at sort of like the smaller scale and the larger scale.
So, Jim, I think since we've gone over the article and we kind of started talking about some of the kind of bigger questions in terms of where is this going to go in the future, it seems like a good time to move into our section of the show called the Dissemination Station. Oh, we got a sound effect. There we go.
Very high tech.
High tech.
Comes a train.
Where we talk sort of about kind of the big take-home points for other behavior analysts and then sort of, the big ideas for the future. I mean, certainly I always read an article like this and I read the results and I say, well, here we go, everybody. You're going to take this to your child welfare heads of every state and show them, look at this great system we have. Do you have something better than this? I don't think you do. There we go. So hire some behavior analysts. Let's get this show on the road. But although there are some states who have adopted some of these curriculum, I'm guessing it's not all 50 have curriculum that are necessarily generating this percentage of kind of successful reunifications.
Oh, no, not at all. I will say, though, that the behavior analyst has come before us and done most of this dissemination work already. And so John Lutzker, who developed the Project 12 Ways program, he stayed in this area and kept doing research, and he did it at different universities. And I don't know his thinking behind this next step that he took, but my guess is, if you think about something like this, Rob, you mentioned you get this article, you're excited about it. Well, now to do something about it, you have to go to the state bureaucracy, right? You've got to deal with heads of the state, and in a way, these programs are kind of designed for a government infrastructure. I mean, it could be done privately, but I think it's probably best viewed as a government service. And so, what Dr. Lutzker did a number of years ago, he actually packaged the Project 12 Ways type curriculum, similar to the Tools of Choice curriculum. He packaged that into a curriculum that was deliverable to a state. And his program is called Safe Care. And he is at Georgia State in Atlanta, and he developed the National Safe Care Training and Research Center. And the goal of the center is to disseminate this model to state child welfare departments across the country and provide support. And so anyone who's interested in the work that we've been describing, this is the place to go. And just search for Safe Care, one word, and you'll find it, and you'll get descriptions of the curriculum and support resources and information about trainings. And there's this really great map that shows the implementation of Safe Care, and there are 6 states that do statewide Safe Care model. Wow. There are a number of states that do counties, and then there are many other sort of individual implementations, in certain regions. And I really think what he did was brilliant, because if the market for what you've developed is the government, then you need a dissemination style that is effective in disseminating technology to the government. Yeah. And what a lot of state departments are going to be interested in are models, right? We'll get the model, you'll come in, you'll train our people, we'll implement the model, and you've got systems and procedures and data sheets around implementation of this model in kind of a government county-based structure. And so I think this is brilliant, because the guy that started the first program and wrote the first article on its impact took it all the way to the dissemination stage, and you don't often see that in behavior analysis.
Yeah, that's very.
I bet
very
he
true.
feels great, right? Some days he's like, I had a bad day, but look what I did.
I know. I'm going to Google this first thing tomorrow. I'm very excited to get some more resources on this topic, because it does feel very much like, like you were saying, Jim, that idea of there's so many great research articles and research studies and great results. And sometimes it just feels like, and then that was that, and nobody cared, or nobody did anything with this information, or they tried and nothing could be done.
Well, even more than no one cared, but the matter of, I've developed this model based on being able to use my graduate students to produce research, right? And sometimes you can develop a lab that's doing excellent work there, but there's no clear path from there and how you're going to disseminate it out further. in a way in which these people who are no longer graduate students but are now behavior analysts can do this for a living, right? So kudos to
Talk about your job placement program, man.
But kudos to him that he thought about that and he thought that far ahead to see like where would this actually be useful and how can I get it?
It's a real unique story in behavior analysis, and I come in contact with a lot of new researchers, a lot of new professors in my travels, and I'm periodically in a position to answer questions and give advice about starting up a research lab and that sort of thing. And what I'm more and more encouraging young researchers to do is to pick lines of research and stick with them. And, one of the things about behavior analysis is that we can be successful in so many areas, and it's fun to do research in a bunch of different areas rather than the same old area, time and time again. But the way that generalizations are made from single case design research is not from an individual study, it's from a line of research, right? You have the initial direct replications, and then you got the systematic replications. And eventually we have enough information to let us predict when something is likely to be successful and when something's not likely to be successful. And what's also nice about that model is that it's decentralized, right? So you guys could do a study and contribute to a line of research, and I could do a study and contribute to it. And so you don't necessarily have to have like a big, heavily resourced lab set up to do this work. We can all kind of pitch in. But that's also the downside of this model. And that is because we are so often working in multiple areas and everyone kind of pitches in to complete lines of research, we have a lot of our lines of research that never close out.
Yeah.
Because there isn't someone there like looking at the whole thing and figuring out, what do we need next? We have a lot of incomplete lines of research in our literature and our applied literature. And so although for, let's say, a new faculty member or a new researcher, it can be really appealing to dabble in a bunch of different areas. I think that if John Lutzker had done that, he likely would not have ended up having the idea to close this out with a dissemination mechanism, right? Because if you're in a bunch of different areas, the literature doesn't get to that point. And then, of course, it's not going to prompt you to have that idea. So I'd love it if we had more of these in other areas, but we don't. And so I'm encouraging, new researchers to think about a more concentrated approach, because I think we can get more done more quickly that way. I think it's more efficient. If you have 20 studies that need conducting and you rely on 20 different labs, that's really inefficient. If you have 1 or 2 labs set up to do it, you can get that done more efficiently. But we just don't have a lot of good examples of that in behavior analysis. And when lines of research close, what's next is, okay, we need practice guidelines. So now we know how to do this thing. It's time to start developing resources to teach clinicians or parents or whomever, teachers, how to do this. And I think that if you don't close out the line of research, you don't have the idea to develop the training mechanisms and do all the dissemination work that's necessary. And so I think this line of research and John Lutzker's work and the eventual development of Safe Care is really a really cool example of that.
But sadly,
so,
not very
folks,
well
no, he's not. Well, he used to be. I mean, I think that's the other thing. I mean, I knew who he was when I was a graduate student, but, a lot of our work in other areas, it's not published in behavioral journals anymore. It started that way. But, just recently I noticed that just last year, there was a review of all the Safe Care research published. And it's published in the Journal of Child and Family Studies, because that's where that kind of work is published. And that's where the readers that you want to read your science, that's where they're reading it, not in JABA, but in Journal of Child and Family Studies. But I think this is a great example where John Lutzker used JABA in the other behavioral journals early on, developing the technology. But then at some point when it's time to start, getting into implementation science, that's when you match the journal outlet with the function or the purpose of the specific article. So if readers are interested in this work, I've got a couple of recommendations. So the BACB, we're kind of wrapping up a project where we're developing resources to help educate the world about just the breadth of areas in which ABA has been successfully applied. And so if you go to BACB.com and go to the About Behavior Analysis page, you'll see a dozen fact sheets, one-page fact sheets on different specialty areas. And we've got, autism and intellectual disabilities, and we've got one on child welfare and education and gerontology and OBM and just, again, a dozen different practice areas. And each fact sheet is just one page, and they're structured the same way. And they've got an overview of the practice area, the first publication, so you can see how long we've been doing this work, recommended readings, additional resources. So that's there, and Dr. Lutzker actually helped develop this fact sheet for us. We used all experts in the areas to develop the content. We just provided the structure. But then what we also did is we've got 9 videos. They're 1-hour videos, and they're all structured identically. They are introductions to specific practice areas. And we invited researchers who were experts in these practice areas to do a 1-hour introduction. And it's not an introduction to their work, it's an introduction to the practice area. And so those are available. And we actually got Dr. Lutzker to do the 1-hour introduction to this area. And so I think if listeners are interested in what we have to offer in the prevention of child maltreatment, the fact sheet at the BACB website and that video are maybe good places to start, and then check out the Safe Care website. If I were kind of involved in this now, I would be working on Safe Care. It's packaged, it's ready to go. Let's get that together with someone in your state and see if we can get some decent implementation out of it.
Currently in Massachusetts, there is no Safe Care. The closest is Rhode Island.
I think one of the challenges that and this is just kind of my anecdotal speculation, but I think when you have a state like Massachusetts where, we're first in the nation in this and this and that and this, there is kind of that paradoxical sense of, are we resting on our laurels a little bit? Because we don't necessarily have to make everything be the most efficient it could be, because what we're doing now, it's doing better than a lot of other states. Whereas I think the states where you see not necessarily more behavior analysts, but I think you see a little bit more kind of new innovation from, year to year, are the states that really have no choice other than we have to find the thing that works because we don't have the money to sort of try this and try that and get poor outcomes. Like, we need good outcomes now. That's all we can afford.
I would be nervous to put Massachusetts in a good position regarding this without seeing some stats, though, because Massachusetts is also pretty hard hit regarding the opioid crisis, and we have many children who are currently in foster care. In our system.
Well, and there could be something in Massachusetts that's kind of functionally similar to Safe Care. It's not Safe Care per se, and who knows what it is, or maybe that hasn't been a priority, or what they're doing is okay, but there are opportunities for improvement. So that's why I think if there are any kind of entrepreneurial listeners out there who are interested about this work, and especially if you have contacts in the county government, which is where the stuff is implemented, or at the state government where the decisions are made, learning about what that is and who does the implementation, because this is a model, right? And so you're going to have, it's a great model and a great curriculum, but the implementation, that's where the rubber meets the road. And so it may be, even if in a state with self-care, they may need ongoing support and implementation. It's unclear how much support the National Training and Research Center is giving all of these initiatives out there. My guess is that it's really variable. And so I think that we can be useful in helping shore up and approve and make more efficient some of the implementation practices when, you already know the curriculum is solid.
Yeah. Jim, do you know offhand if Safe Care allows for sort of like train the trainer type models? It's meant for non-behavior analysts to be able to run the curriculum, correct? Or is it?
Yes.
Okay.
It is not designed for behavior analysts to run the curriculum. And so it definitely is a train the trainer kind of model. Which does kind of open the door to questions about the, what kind of supports are in place. Because I've worked with a number of states on a variety of initiatives over the years, and I've seen all manner of levels of quality implementation.
Jim, I kind of have a question. It's a little on, a little off topic. In terms of just kind of hearing you share sort of the story of this research, and then hearing you talk about Safe Care and John Lutzker's work, I felt like I was listening to, like an episode of sort of Freakonomics of like, this is a big problem, and here's how it was solved. Yet I feel like a lot of the more kind of pop culture type areas where you start hearing kind of about societal change and, large scale programmatic change never really refer to behavior analysis. And I know that every time I hear you speak, whether it's at, at BACB or at some of the other conferences or even now, there's always like a real push from the BACB, from others in the field to get that information out there. Yet sometimes it doesn't feel like it's hitting the mainstream quite the way it should be. Like, I'm always surprised by that. I mean, do you have any kind of thoughts as to why that would be?
I think it's important to keep in mind the context of our discipline. Mm-hmm. So behavior analysis is the new kid on the block. Mm-hmm. Yes, our roots go back a century, but we didn't have a technology really ready for the public till the 60s. And then it was only a pretty small sliver of, what the public needs were. And our numbers were really low until recent years. Mm-hmm. So we're sort of, we're in this era, maybe we're near the end of the area where we're developing the technology. We're trying to figure out, how do we solve these problems? How do we solve them efficiently? And then there are clear dissemination needs, but I think, it's easy to beat ourselves up, like we need to be better at PR and we need to be better at this and that. And that's all true. But there are also these sort of developmental phases that sciences and kind of applied technologies go through. And so if you kind of think about, where we are in the autism area, which is perhaps our most kind of fleshed out area in terms of, getting the technology to people who need it, we're at a pretty good spot, but largely because we had the right advocacy partners. Autism Speaks came along and got, all these state laws passed where we've got brand new funding streams that didn't exist before in most states before their efforts. And then that was, one of the things that really kind of helped put us on the map, and that I think largely explains the number of our practitioners and where they are working today. And so what I would say is, pick an intervention from another discipline, and find out when was that conceived and when was it developed and how many years did it take to sort out? And then what kinds of things happened for that to be recognized and gotten out to some workforce that can deliver it to the public. And I think what you'll typically see is there's a story there. Mm-hmm. And the story kind of unfolded over multiple decades, but the story is usually specific to the technology that's being disseminated. It's not the technology of clinical psychology. Mm-hmm. It's the technology of behavioral activation treatment for major depressive disorder. Mm-hmm. Right? It's more specific that way. Another good example in behavior analysis is the work Doug Woods has done on the behavioral treatment of Tourette syndrome. Mm-hmm. And Doug has a very kind of similar story where he started out where, we had already kind of sorted out how things work in this area, but he did some of the early research, and then he kind of focused his research activities on conducting research that would be better disseminable. Mm-hmm. And now, they've got apps that deliver behavioral treatment for Tourette's. And if you're, going to see a doctor for Tourette's, in childhood, there's a very good chance you're going to be recommended a behavior analytic treatment as the first round of treatment. And that's because of kind of a concentrated dissemination story. And so I think folks who, and I count myself among them, we kind of lament sometimes, well, geez, we've got something to offer here, and the world isn't ready for it. There's an implementation story that needs to happen. Mm-hmm. It's not like they're going to learn about us and then want to do everything that we have to recommend. It's going to be in child welfare and autism treatment and behavioral treatment of Tourette's. And so I think if there's a listener out there who's interested in and passionate in getting a certain approach to solving a problem and getting that maybe better recognized. I think, kind of thinking about this as sometimes a multi-decade story where we've got to do certain things along the way. And some of what we have to do is to develop our technology for non-behavioral implementers. Mm-hmm. Sometimes we have to conduct the right kinds of studies. Sometimes we have to have the right connections and think about where things are going to eventually be disseminated. Like, is it going to be, providers? Is it going to be teachers? Is it going to be, caseworkers working for a state child welfare department? But it's not going to be all of behavior analytic technology for every possible concern appreciated at one time. Mm-hmm. Right. It may be kind of like a multiple exemplar kind of situation where, we just hit the radar and have a reversal for treatment of tics and Tourette's and safe care and autism. And it may be that after a certain number of those, folks will connect the dots and then they'll just want us, period, for whatever. But my guess is that's not going to be the case, and that we're really looking at like the very different dissemination journeys in different areas. And I think that's exciting, especially if you're passionate about a certain technology for some problem in a certain area. There's likely a lot of work that you're going to be able to participate in and be a real help. So, calling all entrepreneurs.
Oh, I know, Jim. It's so true. But don't you ever, have that dream where the story is actually once upon a time behavior analysis and everyone loved us, the end? You really want to get to that part. But it's true. It is a process.
The point that you made, Jim, about selecting big impact outcome measures is really important too, because each of those success stories is tied to something that's really meaningful to people and can be easily discerned as impacted positively through what we've done.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Yeah.
Well, Jim, thank you so much for coming on the show tonight. It was such a pleasure to hear all about this work on child welfare. It was just great to hear from you. It was a real pleasure. Do you have any news you wanted to share from the BACB or any news related to any other pursuits?
No, not right now. We've got our podcast Inside the BACB where we're kind of publishing, kind of new reports about activities. We just went to on-demand testing. That was kind of big news, and
everyone
folks are pretty happy about
excited. That. I'm a little bit mad because I had to wait for it felt like 20 years, and I like the wait, like waiting. I told my students that they're very lucky.
Yeah, after walking through the snow to get to the test center, right? Yeah. No, things change. No, but just, obviously we get the news out from the BACB pretty well, but we'll use the podcast for lots of kind of, hot off the presses announcements along with the newsletter. So subscribe to that and you'll get all that information. Okay. So, well, hey guys, I really appreciate your time today and thanks for having me on the show.
Oh, it was a pleasure, Jim. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
All right. Take care, guys.
All right.
Okay,
bye.
Bye.
Well, we just want to say one more big thank you to Dr. Jim Carr for being on the show and talking to us all about the child welfare system, talking about research in behavior analysis related to child welfare and reunification of parents. I think, like we said, it's a very important topic, and it is really exciting to hear that there is so much amazing work going on in our field for that area.
I really learned a lot.
I did too.
Episode, and I feel very inspired and humbled.
I know certainly anytime I've heard Dr. Carr speak at BACB, anytime he's doing like an invited address, I definitely have that fun sense of, yes, this is the field, baby. This is where you want to be. We're going to do it all. It might take he's saying it might take decades, but we're going to get there. It's going to be awesome. So I hope you all feel that way too. Anyway, let's come to the end of our show. But before we do that, what about that second secret code word, you might be asking? Well, hold on. Hold your horses. I'll tell you the second secret code word right now. It is HIPPO. 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 It is a large water-dwelling mammal. Where did you get that preposterous hypothesis? Did Steve no one's going to get that joke, but you, Diana, because you're laughing. No.
I didn't get it.
No. It's very true, but there's not much to get. It's just the code word you need. It's HIPPO.
My rhymes are bottomless.
Your rhymes are bottomless. Not the hip-hopopotamus, just hippo. All right, and that brings us to the end of another fun-filled episode of ABA Inside Track. Thanks again to Dr. Jim Carr. Thanks to both of you, Jackie and Diana, for co-hosting the show. It's always a pleasure to see you.
Thank you, Rob.
Oh, you're very welcome.
Thank you, Robert.
Oh, thank you. And I don't want to miss this thank you. A big thank you to our listeners out there. We hope you enjoyed the show. Hey, if you did, why not subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, or, wherever you get your podcast. We'd really love it if you left us a review. You can also find us in a lot of other places. You can find these episodes posted online on youtube.com. You can certainly find us if you'd like to reach out on social media. We're on Pinterest, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram as ABA Inside Track. You can also go to our website, abainsidetrack.com, where the episodes are posted and where we have links to various resources, a list of guests we've had on the show, a list of previous episodes, and links to the articles that we discuss. And of course, you can certainly email us at any time at abainsidetrack@gmail.com. Thank you to Kyle Sturry for our interstitial music. Thank you to Dr. Jim Carr, not just for being a guest on tonight's show, but also for recording our intro and outro themes. Thank you to Dan Thabit of Liquid Studios podcast editing for his editing work. And thanks to Hollis Irvin from the Sycamore Workshop for our logo and graphics design. We'll be back next week with another full-length episode. But until then, keep responding. Bye.
Bye.